I think marijuana dispensaries would be good for the state for people who need it for medicinal purposes. I've heard that medical marijuana can help a lot of people with their medical problems, whereas traditional drugs might have a lot of side effects, and that medical marijuana might be really helpful for them.
I guess I have mixed feelings about it. For recreational use, while I know many people that use marijuana on a regular basis, sometimes I think that there are safety issues involved.
As this industry builds, it should be inclusive. Blacks cannot be the ones that go to jail and others go to the bank.
If black people are trying to make business out of it, that's great. Because instead of giving the money away to everybody else, we can use it in the community to better it off.
Sometimes I feel like it does more harm than good. And then I'm also thinking about the number of people who were incarcerated for, similar activities for years and years and years who don't have their lives anymore.
I think that'd be great if Latinos, all minorities, Hispanics, African Americans, all of us could get down with it. That'd be great.
It's a free market. It's a democratic society. Why not?
And welcome to our 50th season of Basic Black. Some of you are joining us live on our broadcast, and others are joining us live on Facebook. Either way, thank you for joining us. I'm Tina Martin of WGBH News. Callie Crossley has the night off. Joining me in studio are Brandon Banks. He's co-founder and chief operations officer for Natural Selections Dispensary in Colorado. His company is looking to open dispensaries and an operating facility here in the Commonwealth. We have Dr. Saida Grundy, who is the assistant professor of sociology and African American Studies at Boston University. To my left is Rahsaan Hall. He's director of the Racial Justice Program for the Mass ACLU, and Chenille Lyndsey. She's founder and president of Ardent Cannabis. That's a Boston-based biotech company created to provide safe and effective products within the cannabis industry. Also to note that she also helped to draft this state's cannabis law. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
And we saw some very mixed reaction from folks in the community. I guess I'll put it out to all of you. The first question would be, is this an open market? Do you believe it's an open market?
It's a tough question to answer. People think that this is a free market economy, think that the cannabis industry in specific is an industry that is going to be inclusive. It's an industry that is going to welcome everyone. The reality of the situation is it's a bit lopsided, unfortunately. I'm one of the few African-American professionals in the industry. I'm doing my part to kind of wave the flag and let everyone know that, the stigma needs to be addressed. The disparity in arrest needs to be addressed. The fact that, as licensed cannabis operators, are in business, we need to address the disparity in arrest. We need to address a lot of the social justice issues that come along with the space. So hopefully I can do my part, and hopefully others can. But to answer your question, no, it's certainly not at that point right now, at least.
And I hear you agree.
What I heard in the comment, I think, was a very idealistic sense of this. It should be an open market. It should reflect sort of a democratic enterprising ideal. But of course, we know when I hear free market, I hear deregulation, I hear all sorts of inequalities manifesting inside of those free markets, and that's what we see now, right? So I actually do think there need to be some stipulations around this in order to address historic inequalities, lack of access to enterprise, lack of access to entrepreneurship, capital, et cetera. So when I hear free market, I hear, oh, great, dog eat dog, which is, we know that's really kept marginalized people out of every other capitalist enterprise we've had in this country. What I hope to see are some plans to actually address historic inequalities.
And Rahsaan, we'll toss that to you. Plans to address it. I know that you do a lot of work in trying to address disparity. So any plans along the lines when it comes to these dispensaries?
So I think it's important to recognize that part of the legislation that Chenille was pivotal in helping to draft was an equity provision to make sure that communities that were most harshly hit by marijuana prohibition have an opportunity to get a foothold in this industry, because if you look at any other industry in this country, there's never parity. And so there has to be initiatives to make sure people are included and create opportunities for folks who have not been there. So one of the things that we've been doing is advocating for, the creation of regulations that would try to identify ways that would increase opportunities for communities of color, whether it's creating different types of grants or focusing funds towards those communities that have been hardest hit by the war on drugs. And so it's good that we have people like Chenille, who is on the Marijuana Advisory Board to the Cannabis Control Commission, and Shalene Title, who's also on the Cannabis Control Commission, who are bringing that lens and that view. But I think there's a larger conversation around equity and economic justice, particularly in Black communities and communities of color, because America suffers from the fallacy of meritocracy, that if you work hard, you can get in, and it doesn't always work like that. When you look at lending from banks, there are racial disparities. When you look at mortgages, there are disparities. When you look at employment rates and employment discrimination, there are disparities. So there are structural things that exist. So one of my roles as an advocate is to lift that up for people to understand that it's there, but then to push on the institutions to really force them to take a look at it critically and try to develop initiatives to address it.
Now, Chenille, I'm going to toss to you, because in this process, was it difficult for people to see things through your lens, through the lens of some inequalities, and trying to make sure that everyone has a seat at the table, so to speak?
Well, thankfully, both Shalene and I were involved in the drafting process, and I think that was critical. Being able to bring these issues up while the initial initiative was being formed. And then during the campaign, we were starting to hear from the opposition that these inequities didn't exist. And it was at that point we were able to rely on the ACLU's report to show actually what was happening in Boston. And that maybe people weren't seeing it in other parts of the state, but that didn't mean that it wasn't happening here, and the disparities here, we know that Boston is a very segregated city. So what some people are seeing isn't what others are seeing. And when you look at what happened with legalization of medical marijuana, you can see there that it was not an open market. And what you had there was very, very high barriers to entry, licensing fees that were $30,000 plus, and the inability for people of color to have that kind of capital and not really be any kind of intention surrounding these inequities. And so what we were doing was being intentional from the get-go in the underlying initiative, and then thankfully when the House came and tried to change the marijuana bill and pull the two provisions that we got in there, there already had been such a groundswell of support around these issues from the broader community. That's why I'm so glad we're actually able to be here today talking about this, because this process of making sure that we have access really has just begun. We're beginning the drafting of the regulations. As Rahsaan mentioned, I'm on the advisory board. There's specific mandates within the law that say that the regulations have to improve our communities, that there's actually priority licensing for people who can demonstrate that their business will lead to economic empowerment in the areas where they are located. And other broader provisions, really kind of a rising tide provisions that ensure that minorities and veterans and all kind of marginalized groups have access here. So I think that challenge is making that happen, making that meaningful.
When we talk about access to capital, Brandon, I'm looking at you because you have a major, you're hoping to bring a major, development here.
Absolutely.
And so how are you trying to get that done, and how difficult is that?
I mean, it's extremely difficult. You can't access capital in the traditional ways. You have to rely on social networks. You have to rely on, your peer groups. You have to cast the widest net possible. And unfortunately, as African Americans, we typically don't have those routes to capital. Again, my raise is going to be pretty significant by any measure. I'm confident we're going to achieve it, but by any measure, it's going to be a very significant raise. And it's not something that's insurmountable, but it's also something that's not really easily attainable. I have the track record of success in Colorado, been in the industry. A lot of people don't have the same sort of background that I do. I'm one of the fortunate ones who actually achieved and making things happen in this industry. And again, it's not easy. So again, some of the things we need to be looking for are lower these barriers to entry. The sort of rising tide provision that Chenille mentioned it's going to be critical. You're going to want to look towards craft sort of operators. That's what we're going to be looking for. We don't necessarily need big businesses in this industry. And again, I'm speaking from someone who has to do a large capital raise. I encourage competition. I encourage this to be more of a free market and a more equitable market. So that's the position I'm coming from. But again, it's really difficult to actually do these sorts of raises.
And you're someone who actually has done it, and you do it. So what about people who have never done this before, who are hoping to do this? How optimistic should they be?
I think we can see how successful they've been in the past, right? And that's why I think when we are drafting these regulations, we as a community need to demand that there's going to be support for entrepreneurs in the space that don't have access to capital, that there's going to be these networks built that traditional entrepreneurs have that we just, that have been elusive to us, that there's going to be money, tax revenue that's going back into workforce training and development, because that's part of it as well, making sure that we are trained. And I think that there's something else that we have to consider is that, when you're thinking about not only the historical inequities, but then also the fact that we have seen, even after legalization, inequities persist when it comes to arrest and prosecution. So then you're actually asking people who have spent quite a bit of time building up a professional career to take that risk to then go into an industry that it's difficult to raise money, and you probably are going to get prosecuted before somebody else. And so I think it's about, us really coming together and ensuring that these final rules lay the groundwork for small businesses, for local businesses, encouraging that outside money that's coming in to partner up with local people. Because you would have many more people of color involved if they had access to this capital or if they were required to be involved. And so I think that's certainly one way. And it's not just for the plant-touching businesses, but this is an issue on the ancillary side as well. When you're looking to raise capital for production or for whatever your business is trying to achieve.
You mentioned something, the idea that the threat of prosecution is still out there, and there are folks who are in a position that they can take that risk, or they have the benefit of the networks to get access to capital like that through non-traditional means. But one of the things that I'm always impressed by and hopeful for is Black folks always got to hustle. Right? We are some hustling people, and we come up with ways to do things, but the risk is so much greater. When the current occupant of the White House and his Attorney General, Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, who has said that fine people don't smoke marijuana, is leading the charge on prosecuting people, the stakes are much higher. And so, and I think that goes to that point where it's that much more important to create opportunities for people who don't always have access to the traditional lines of money, but also face a greater risk.
Absolutely. And I think we're in a point historically where there is a danger of returning to that Nixonian LBJ era of just particularly criminalizing anything that can be typified as Black behavior, as Black activity. But also, I think that when you commodify something, when you monetize it, racism's favorite location is the self-interest of capitalism, right? That it's no place like the self-interest of capitalism. So all these sort of otherwise, innocuous policies become policies that produce racial disparities, because that is how racism operates when it comes to competition in the market. But absolutely, when you bring up our current DOJ, our current Attorney General, and you bring up, we could have a tremendous rollback, right? And a rollback that it has even more racial disparities than we've seen in maybe 20 years, that we are actually decriminalizing white drug use, and we're criminalizing Black enterprise in drugs.
And that's actually what I was just going to touch on, was that in this climate, is this something that could potentially be beneficial, for people of color under the current administration and with all the issues that we've had in this country racially?
I could let you know, I'm terrified. Absolutely. I'm in a plant-touching business in a legal state doing something that is federally illegal. Mm-hmm. It is very tough to get a full night's sleep at night. It's a product of the environment, it's the product of the administration, it's the product of the climate that we live in, that unfortunately African Americans are typically targeted in these sorts of endeavors. And I have a family that, I've got to feed and support. I'm terrified, but at the same time, I believe in what I do every day. I'm empowered by the fact that, we have 22 employees right now. We're going to expand to 100 employees as soon as we move to Massachusetts. I am empowering my entire team, my family. So I'm going to, I'm going to wave the flag, but it's tough. It's absolutely tough.
And I would imagine that you believe it's something that other folks should get involved with too, that it's something that could eventually be beneficial.
I've been in the industry for 8 years now. And again, I think I took a conscious approach to make sure that I became a sort of a model, a bit of a mentor to other people looking to get in the industry. I needed to be a face of the industry because there's so few of us and so few of us willing to take this risk. Again, I believe in the industry wholeheartedly, 100%.
So we're talking about all these difficulties, and Rahsaan, Milford just banned the use of recreational marijuana in their town in September. There are many cities and towns who are just saying, no, we don't want any part of it. Do you think that creates an opportunity to discriminate? Because there are places that are just saying, we just don't want this here.
Absolutely, because there's this notion of who is going to be the consumers. Right, and there's talking about kind of the criminalization of activities and certain people. It's one thing when you think about young white kids smoking pot in their college dorm rooms, but it's another thing when you're thinking about a retail outlet who's going to be driving to our town to come purchase marijuana. And so, of course, people are going to say, no, we don't want to have that in our neighborhood, in our community. And whether or not that there's an increased request for police enforcement of kind of the deregulated or the unregulated market, and looking for ways to criminalize people of color is also going to be a problem. And so we've got to be aware of it, speak out against it. But there's certainly the autonomy that municipalities have, that they're going to do those things.
Right, absolutely. I think that the threat to a status quo that comes from the enterprise and merchant side of things is a much larger apparatus than thinking about use, right? You're thinking about people who will have political capital because of that, right? Who will have tax-based capital who can actually change what your city council looks like. Right. I think that is a greater threat to the status quo.
And so, Chenille, are there numbers when we talk about people who actually patronize these dispensaries? Do we have any stats on who they are?
Well, we know that cannabis use is across all different, demographics and genders. Who's actually patronizing these medical dispensaries right now is actually not many people of color, because at this point you have a medical system where you have to be on a registry, you have to pay to get a medical card at this point. So most people are actually still part of that unregulated market, whether they're consuming in that market or whether they're actually, part of the enterprise in that market. And I think that's our challenge when we are moving to a legal system, is how do we embrace as many of those people in the unregulated market as possible? And I think that that's a particular way of looking at legalization that is very different than a kind of big industry way of looking at legalization. It looks at what are the local people doing, what are people in these communities doing, and how do we provide a bridge from criminal activity to regulated and real jobs. Right. And I think that definitely is the challenge when I'm thinking about the federal issue that we were talking about earlier. The cannabis business is a big business. And cannabis, when people have access to cannabis and using it as a medicine, they don't want to go back. And so I think that there's some concern on my side about what's happening on the federal level, but I think when you start to see real enforcement, that people are going to come forward as they have been, and no one's ready to roll legalization back. And I think that it's very hard to unscramble an egg. And once people already move forward, what are you going to do? And I think that the way that we protect ourselves from that is making sure that these businesses are giving back to the communities. Because that's when you start to have a community effort and looking and saying, wait a minute, we've been able to reduce the number of people that are going to jail. The people that have been impacted are actually now working. And these businesses are giving back to the community. And then I think that's also our challenge on the advisory board and the commission, is to make sure that the rules that we have and the standards for people that are actually able to move from that medical market into that regulated market are giving back to the community. Because that right there, essentially we already have a market that exists. And we have to go and try to make that market more equitable, because it isn't right now.
Yeah, and that's one of the concerns for me is, I like to say we here in Massachusetts suffer from liberal exceptionalism. We think that because we're a quote-unquote democratic or blue state, which we're really not, that we've got all of these other things figured out, and so that people who are in the industry already may want to open up a place in Roxbury and say, well, I'm providing a service to the community and I'm giving back. But what are the pathways to ownership that people are creating? What is the investment that people are making in financial literacy in those communities? And so those are some of the problems that, if not addressed, you'll have people, you know, just like with gentrification, I'm moving in, I'm improving the community, and look, there's a Whole Foods in my neighborhood, but we know what happens to Black and Latino communities when the Whole Foods come in.
Right. You know, and the project of creating this war on drugs that became a war on Black and brown people was a bipartisan product. And I think there's a great deal of denial and amnesia about how it was the most bipartisan effort politically that the United States has ever seen, right? That the effort to criminalize Black and brown people, particularly poor Black and brown people, you know, LBJ was as involved in that as Nixon was, and this was the sort of the banner being waved by both parties. And I think that, you know, the interest in, you know, it's very easy to get interested in the rhetoric of like, well, you know, we're just talking about bad guys, but then you start to, you know, how you racialize that and how you racialize who's moving into a space and how you racialize population control. That has lots of seductive properties for both parties.
Brandon, I'm looking at you. So that means I'm going to ask you a question.
Go for it.
When you say that you're terrified, but you're still going to move forward,
Absolutely.
What are you most fearful of?
You know, anyone in this industry is fearful of federal intervention. All it will take is one letter from Jeff Sessions to one of the big boys to shut this entire industry down. And not trying to give him any ideas, but you know, essentially he can do this thing with the label pen. It's pretty simple. You know, I'd like to think that we have a sort of groundswell of support. I think we have, you know, a lot of people at the grassroots efforts who would come out and support the industry, whether it's adult use, whether it's medical medicine, medical marijuana, I should say. But again, I can't be so confident of that. You know, we've seen what the political process has gotten us. So it's tough. Again, it does keep me up at night.
And the process itself is long and arduous, I would imagine. And so is there any point where you say, okay, this is where I'm going to stop pursuing this?
Not necessarily. You know, again, I'm speaking from an individual level at this point. You know, I come from a background where I'm from one of the toughest neighborhoods in Chicago. I've dealt with a lot of things in my lifetime. I think I can handle this. So, and not only that, I think I'm adept at, you know, running a business, being successful. We have the cultivation, we have a lot of retail locations that we think are going to be key and prime. So on a personal level, I don't necessarily think so. But again, as far as the broader idea and the broader purpose, I don't necessarily know if a lot of people are prepared for what they're going to be in for as far as this industry goes. There's an extreme sort of capital reserves that you need. You know, you have to pay leases on properties for 2-3 years. You have to pay these exorbitant licensing fees, you know, all for the risk of not being approved for these licenses. So again, I think as an industry, we need to push for more inclusion, and more inclusion is going to work for everyone, not necessarily just Black and Latino communities, but everyone in general will benefit from a little bit less regulation, I think, and lower these barriers to entry and allow for smaller producers. So again, while I think I'm well prepared, I can't necessarily just look out for self.
And so Rahsaan, he's not looking out for self. If someone like him were to come to get some support from the ACLU, what what could they expect? What kind of support are you offering people?
Well, I mean, there's no direct representation that we're engaged in. We're more involved in policy advocacy, and so to the extent that there are ideas or policy suggestions, that's something that we could lift up and share and push for.
And Chenille wants to chime
Yes,
in.
I'm very excited
Okay.
to tell people that, part of...
You get the last word, by the way.
Awesome. Part of what we're doing is ensuring that the community does have a voice in these particular recommendations that have to do with equity. And we're actually having a meeting, a public meeting, on the 6th
of November.
6th of November at 6 p.m. It's going to be in the Boston area, probably the Roxbury area, and it will be up on the Cannabis Control Commission's website. But we're inviting members of the community because this is what it's about, what will help our communities, and we want to hear from everyone. So
that's a great way to end the show. Thank you all very much. That is the end of our show. Thanks to all of our guests, and thank you for joining us tonight. Stay with us right now as we continue the conversation on marijuana dispensaries online at Facebook Live. Take care.